My name is Eleanor Voss. I was 26 when the word gold digger was said loud enough for 200 people to hear it, and quiet enough that only I understood it was meant to end me. It happened between the toasts and the cake. That strange, suspended hour at a wedding when the ceremony is over, but the night hasn't decided what it wants to become yet. I was standing near the string lights with a glass of champagne I hadn't touched, listening to my new mother-in-law, Diane Whitmore, laugh with her sister about the flower arrangements, when she turned to me with a smile that didn't reach anywhere near her eyes. "You landed well, didn't you?" she said. Not a question. A verdict already reached. I remember the band was playing something slow. I remember the smell of gardenias, sweet and a little too heavy, the kind of smell that clings to a memory forever after. I remember thinking, absurdly, that my shoes were starting to hurt. "Excuse me?" I said. "Nathaniel's father built that company from nothing," she went on, still smiling for the benefit of anyone watching. "And here you are, some assistant from a temp agency, and now you're wearing my mother's pearls." She reached out and touched the necklace at my throat, the one Nathaniel had given me that morning, the one that had, in fact, belonged to his grandmother. "Gold digger," she said, so lightly, so casually, like she was commenting on the weather. "It's all right. I won't hold it against you. Everyone has to survive somehow." She walked away before I could answer. That was the cruelest part, not the accusation, but the fact that she didn't wait to see what it did to me. She already knew. I didn't cry. I want to say that clearly because in the version of this story people expect, the woman runs to the bathroom and sobs into a hand towel while her bridesmaids console her. That isn't what happened. What happened is that I stood very still, and something in me went quiet in a way I didn't have a name for yet. I had met Nathaniel 3 years earlier, at a badly lit conference room in a building that smelled like carpet glue, where I was covering for his usual assistant during a merger review. I was 23, buried in student loans from a business degree I wasn't sure I'd ever use, and I had exactly one good blazer that I rotated, so no one would notice I only owned one good blazer. He asked me a question about a footnote in a contract that everyone else in the room had missed. I answered it. He looked at me the way you look at something you didn't expect to find in a place you'd stopped expecting anything from. We didn't fall in love quickly. That's a detail I think matters, though people rarely ask. It took 8 months of him finding reasons to walk past my desk before he finally asked me to coffee, and even then I said no twice, because I had watched enough of my mother's life to know exactly what people say about women who marry up. I had built my whole adult identity around never being that woman. And now, at my own wedding, in front of everyone I loved, I had been declared her anyway, by the one person whose good opinion I would never be able to earn through effort alone. I looked across the reception and found Nathaniel by the bar, laughing at something his groomsman said, utterly unaware that his mother had just detonated something in the middle of our wedding. I made a decision in that moment, though I didn't fully understand it until much later. I decided I would not make a scene, not because I was weak and not because I forgave her. I decided it because I understood, with a clarity that frightened me a little, that Diane Whitmore had spent 30 years constructing a version of reality where she was the last honest woman in a family surrounded by opportunists, and that a public confrontation tonight would only prove, to her and to everyone watching, that she'd been right about me all along. So instead I smiled. I found my sister-in-law, Priya, and asked her to dance. I let the band's song carry me somewhere else for 4 minutes. And underneath the smiling, a small, cold, patient part of my mind had already begun keeping score, not of insults to avenge, but of truths I intended, eventually, to lay gently on a table where everyone could see them. I didn't know yet what those truths were. I only knew that a woman who accuses so quickly, so specifically, so comfortably, is usually not describing you. She is describing something she recognizes. The morning after the wedding, I sat on the edge of a hotel bed in my going-away dress, still folded over a chair, and I turned the pearl necklace over in my hands like it might explain itself to me. Nathaniel found me there. He'd slept like a man with nothing on his conscience, which told me, gently, that no one had told him yet. "You're quiet," he said. I could have told him right then. Some version of me, a version I respect, honestly, more than the one who chose otherwise, wanted to. But I had learned something from watching my own mother for 20 years, that when you bring an accusation to a man about his mother on the morning after your wedding, you are not just reporting an event. You are asking him to choose, publicly and immediately, in a moment when he has no context and no time to think. I didn't want a reflexive defense of me. I wanted eventually an honest reckoning from him. Those are different things, and I was patient enough, or maybe just proud enough, to wait for the second one. "I'm fine," I said. "Tired." He kissed my forehead and went to shower, and I sat there with the pearls in my palm, thinking about the word Diane had used. Gold digger. It's a strange phrase when you actually sit with it. It assumes the digger is the dishonest one, and the gold simply sits there, innocent, waiting to be found by whoever deserves it. It never asks how the gold got buried in the first place, or who buried it, or what they were hiding when they did. I hadn't grown up around money. My father repaired refrigerators for 31 years in a town where the winters were long and the tips were smaller than the drive there. My mother kept books for a hardware store until her hands started shaking too much to hold a pen steady. We were not a family that discussed inheritance, because there wasn't one. What we had instead was an unspoken agreement that you did not marry for comfort, because comfort that isn't earned has a way of being taken back the moment someone decides you don't deserve it anymore. That belief was the actual reason I had said no to Nathaniel twice. Not modesty. Fear. I understood, on some bone-deep level, that women who marry into money are granted a strange kind of provisional citizenship, welcomed at the border but always subject to review, always one bad dinner party away from deportation. Diane's comment hadn't surprised me, because it was cruel. It had surprised me because it confirmed something I'd been braced for since the day Nathaniel first asked for my number. 3 days after the wedding, back in our apartment, the modest one, the one I'd insisted we keep even after the engagement, much to Diane's visible confusion, I finally told Nathaniel what his mother had said. I told him plainly, without embellishment, without tears, the way you'd report a fact you'd already made peace with. He went very still. "She said that? At the reception? To your face?" Word for word. He was quiet for a long moment, and I watched him do something I would come to respect deeply over the following months. He didn't rush to comfort me, and he didn't rush to defend her. He sat with it. "I need to think about what to do with that," he finally said. "Not because I don't believe you. Because I do, and I don't yet know what believing you is going to cost." I loved him more in that sentence than I had at the altar. What neither of us knew yet, what I wouldn't learn for another 4 months, in the strange, slow way that family truths tend to surface, through overheard calls and old photographs and one document that fell out of a filing cabinet at exactly the moment it was supposed to, was that Diane Whitmore had not always been Diane Whitmore. That the woman who had called me a gold digger with such total, comfortable certainty had once, a very long time ago, been a 24-year-old receptionist named Diane Kowalski, who had married Nathaniel's father 2 years after his first wife left him, and 11 months before his company's most profitable patent was filed. I didn't go looking for that story. I want to be honest about that because I think it matters. I wasn't building a case. I was simply, quietly, paying attention, the way you do when you've decided that the truth, left alone long enough, tends to introduce itself. It was Priya who first mentioned the box. Priya was Nathaniel's cousin, not his sister, though the two of them had grown up close enough that the distinction rarely mattered. She was an archivist by training, a real one, the kind who wore white cotton gloves to handle old letters and got genuinely angry about improperly stored photographs, and she was the only member of the Whitmore family who had ever treated me like a person rather than a verdict waiting to be delivered. "There's a whole box of Grandma Eleanor's things in the attic at the lake house," she told me one afternoon for months after the wedding, while we sat on her porch drinking iced tea that had gone mostly to water. "Your namesake, funny enough. Diane's been promising to sort through it for a decade. She never will. Too many ghosts in there for her taste." I had known I shared a name with Nathaniel's grandmother. No one had mentioned it, not at the wedding, not in the toasts, not once in 3 years of dating. I found that curious in a way I couldn't yet explain, so I asked Priya, gently, if I could see the box sometime. She said yes without hesitation because Priya believed, correctly, that history belonged to whoever was willing to actually look at it. The box, when we finally opened it together on a rainy Saturday 2 weeks later, was full of the ordinary debris of a life: church programs, a moth-eaten christening gown, a stack of recipe cards in looping cursive. But near the bottom, in a manila envelope gone soft with age, there was a stack of photographs and, tucked behind them, a folded newspaper clipping from a regional business journal, dated 31 years earlier. The headline was about a patent dispute. Nathaniel's father, Richard Whitmore, had been sued by his first wife's family. Her father had been his original business partner, and the patent in question, the one that eventually became the foundation of the Whitmore Group's fortune, had been developed jointly on the first wife's father's equipment, using research the first wife herself had contributed to as a chemical engineer before she left the company, and the marriage, in the same devastating year. Richard had settled the lawsuit quietly. The first wife received a modest payout and a non-disclosure agreement. And 11 months after the ink dried, Richard married his 24-year-old receptionist, Diane Kowalski, a young woman with no engineering background, no equity in the original patent, no family connection to the company at all, who simply happened to be young, warm, unattached, and present at exactly the right moment in a wounded, wealthy, recently divorced man's life. I sat with that clipping for a long time before I said anything to Priya. "She never talks about any of this," Priya said quietly, watching my face. "I always assumed it was just because divorce is messy. I never really thought about the timeline until right now, looking at it with you. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment because it would be dishonest to pretend it was simple. I did not feel triumph. I felt something closer to grief. A strange, second-hand sorrow for a 24-year-old receptionist I would never meet, who had probably also once stood in a room full of people who assumed they understood exactly why she was there, and who had spent the next 3 decades, perhaps, trying to outrun that assumption by aiming it at someone else the very first chance she got. Diane hadn't called me a gold digger because she'd found evidence of my greed. She'd called me a gold digger because it was the only story she knew how to tell about a young woman who married into wealth, because it was, whether she'd ever admitted it to herself or not, the story of her own life, and it is a particular kind of loneliness to be the only person in a room who recognizes the shape of an old wound in someone else's harmless silhouette. I didn't share the clipping with Nathaniel that night. I needed first to decide what kind of truth I wanted to tell. There is a version of this story where I photocopy that newspaper clipping, wait for the next family dinner, and lay it on the table in front of Diane the moment she opens her mouth about me again. I thought about that version. I won't pretend I didn't. There were nights, lying awake next to Nathaniel, when I ran through the whole scene in vivid, satisfying detail, her face going pale, her sister's fork stopping halfway to her mouth, the particular silence that follows a truth nobody was prepared to hear out loud. I didn't do it. Not because I was too gracious for the impulse. I want to be honest that the impulse was real and human, and I don't think less of myself for having felt it, but because I understood, somewhere underneath the anger, that humiliating Diane Whitmore in front of her family would not undo a single thing she'd said to me. It would simply hand her a matching accusation to make about me in return, and a truer one this time, that I'd gone digging in her past the way she'd accused me of digging into her son's future. I thought instead about my own mother, who used to say that the fastest way to lose an argument with a cruel person is to become cruel back, because then the only thing left to argue about is who started it. So I waited. I let 5 more months pass. I got to know Diane not as an adversary to be exposed, but cautiously, almost against my own better judgment, as a person, in the ordinary, unglamorous way people get to know each other. Over dishes at Thanksgiving, in the car on the way to a hospital when Nathaniel's father had a minor cardiac scare that turned out to be nothing, in the strange intimacy of standing next to someone at 2 a.m. in a waiting room, both of you too frightened to speak. I watched her more closely in that time than I think she ever noticed. I watched the way she flinched, almost imperceptibly, whenever anyone mentioned Richard's first wife, even in passing, even about something as small as an old recipe. I watched how carefully she'd curated the story of her own arrival into this family. Always, we fell in love very quickly, never any mention of the 11 months, never any mention of a patent, never any mention of a name. I began to understand that Diane wasn't cruel by nature. She was frightened and had been frightened for 31 years, and fear that old calcifies into something that looks a great deal like cruelty if you only see it from the outside. That understanding didn't erase what she'd said to me at my own wedding. I want to be clear about that too. Compassion is not the same as forgiveness, and forgiveness is not the same as forgetting, and I hadn't arrived at any of the three yet. But it changed what kind of response I was willing to give her. I no longer wanted to destroy the story she'd built her whole identity around. I wanted, instead, to offer her a way to set it down. I chose a Sunday in early spring, almost exactly a year after the wedding. I asked Nathaniel to invite his parents to our apartment, the modest one, the one Diane had always found faintly embarrassing to visit, for dinner. Just the four of us. No audience, no witnesses, none of the theater that a public reckoning would have required. I cooked the meal myself. Something plain and careful, a roast chicken, the kind of food that asks nothing of anyone except to be eaten slowly. I didn't tell Nathaniel exactly what I intended to say. I only told him that I needed him beside me, and that whatever happened, I needed him to let me finish. Over dessert, I brought out the manila envelope. I didn't slide it across the table like evidence in a trial. I held it in my lap for a moment first, and I said, "Diane, I found something in the box of your mother-in-law's things at the lake house. I want to give it to you, not to hurt you, but because I think you should have it, and because I think we should talk about something that's been sitting underneath every conversation we've ever had." I watched the color leave her face as she recognized the clipping. I watched Richard go very quiet in the particular way of a man realizing a room contains more history than he'd accounted for. "I'm not telling you this to embarrass you," I said, and my voice was steadier than I expected it to be. "I'm telling you because at my wedding, you called me a gold digger in front of 200 people on the single happiest day of my life, and I have spent a year trying to understand why a woman who didn't know me at all would reach for that particular word so quickly and so easily.
I think I understand now."
I think it's because somewhere a long time ago, someone made you feel like that word belonged to you, and you've been terrified of it ever since. Terrified enough that the fastest way to survive it was to hand it to someone else before anyone could hand it to you again. Diane didn't speak for a long moment. When she finally did, her voice had none of the polish it usually carried. "You don't know what it was like," she said. "Everyone in this family for 30 years has looked at me and wondered the exact same thing you think I accused you of. Every single holiday, every single toast. I heard it in every silence, in every room I ever walked into for a decade." "I believe you," I said. "I'm not asking you to apologize for surviving that. I'm asking you to stop making me survive a version of it too." There was no dramatic collapse, no tearful embrace, no tidy Hollywood ending. Diane sat very still, holding a 31-year-old newspaper clipping about a life she'd spent 3 decades trying to outrun, and for the first time since I'd met her, I watched her let herself be seen instead of performing certainty at me. "I never told Richard the first knew about the settlement," she said quietly, not looking at either of us. "I always assumed everyone thought I married him for it. Maybe I was afraid that if I ever admitted I knew, it would mean it was true." Richard reached over and took her hand, and I understood, watching them, that some conversations are 30 years overdue not because no one had the courage to start them, but because no one had yet built the kind of safety in which they could survive being started. Nothing was resolved that night in the way people want stories to resolve. Diane didn't become warm overnight. I didn't stop feeling, every so often, a flicker of the old wariness whenever she walked into a room. Old wounds don't close because a truth gets spoken out loud at a dinner table. They close, if they close at all, slowly, through 100 small acts of choosing differently than you did before. But something did shift. In the weeks that followed, Diane began asking me questions she'd never asked before, not performative ones, designed to be repeated later as evidence of how gracious she'd been, but real ones. About my parents. About the refrigerator repair business my father had run for 31 years. About the hardware store ledgers my mother had kept until her hands wouldn't hold a pen steady. I told her, and for the first time, I watched her listen without already knowing, in advance, what kind of woman my answers would prove me to be. I never told anyone else in the family about the clipping. Not Priya, though I suspect she guessed something had shifted. Not Nathaniel's aunts, who continued, for a while longer, to speculate about me in low voices at family gatherings, the way people do when a rumor has outlived the person who started it. I let it go unanswered, because I had already gotten what I actually wanted. Not their approval, which I understood by then I would never fully win through explanation, but my own certainty, which no longer depended on winning it. That, I think, was the real transformation. At the wedding, I had needed, badly, for Diane to take back what she'd said. A year later, I found I didn't need that anymore. I only needed to know, privately and completely, that the word she'd used had never actually described me, that it had described a fear she'd been carrying since she was 24 years old, and that I had been standing close enough to it, at exactly the wrong moment, to catch its shadow. On our first anniversary, Nathaniel gave me a small velvet box. Inside it was a second string of pearls, smaller, older, slightly yellowed with age. I didn't recognize them at first. They were my grandmother's, he said. The first Eleanor's. Priya found them in the same box. Diane wanted you to have them. He paused. She asked me to tell you that she thought, given everything, you should be the one to decide whether you wanted them, or whether it was too much. I sat with that gift for a long while before I put it on. There was something almost unbearably tender in it, an old woman I had never met, who had once been dismissed and settled and quietly written out of the story of the very fortune she'd helped build, offering her pearls, across 2 remarrying generations and 31 years, to a woman she would never know, through the hands of the very daughter-in-law who had spent 3 decades avoiding her ghost. I wore them to dinner at Diane's house the following week. She noticed immediately, and for a moment neither of us said anything. "They suit you," she finally said. Not a verdict this time. Just an observation, offered plainly, the way you might comment on the weather when the weather has, for once, turned out fine. "Thank you for finding them," I said. "Thank you," she said, and I understood she wasn't only talking about the pearls, for not telling everyone what I said to you. I hadn't, in the end, needed to. The words she'd used at my wedding had been meant to define me before anyone else had the chance to. It had, instead, ended up defining something about her, a fear old enough to have outlived the marriage it was born from, patient enough to wait 31 years for a stranger in white to walk close enough to catch its edge. People ask me, sometimes, why I never confronted Diane publicly. Why I didn't stand in the middle of that reception and answer her the moment she said it, the way the title of this story seems to promise I did. I understand the appetite for that version. There is a satisfaction in watching a cruelty answered instantly, in the same room, with the same audience, so that the humiliation lands exactly where it was aimed. But I've come to believe that the loudest response isn't always the truest one. What I actually did, what I would do again if I had to choose, was quieter and, I think, harder. I waited. I paid attention. I let a woman's cruelty teach me something about her fear, instead of only about her opinion of me. And when I finally did respond, a year later, at a table with no audience at all, I wasn't trying to win an argument in front of 200 wedding guests. I was trying to end one that had actually been going on for 31 years in a family I had only just married into, over a word that had never really belonged to me in the first place. I still have the newspaper clipping. I keep it in the same manila envelope, tucked now into a drawer in our apartment, not as a weapon I might need again, but as a reminder of the exact moment I understood something I think is true of almost every accusation hurled too quickly, too specifically, too comfortably, that the people who reach fastest for a cruel word are very often describing, without meaning to, the wound they never let anyone see. My name is Eleanor Voss. I was 26 when a word tried to define me at my own wedding, and 27 when I finally understood that the kindest, most complete answer I could give it wasn't a rebuttal. It was patience, followed by the truth, offered gently enough that someone else could finally set her own fear down.